Alright, let's get into our first topic then. And should we give billions more to the NHS? Hospital chiefs are calling for an emergency injection of £3 billion to cover unexpected costs. They're struggling with the impact of strikes, redundancies and rise in medicine prices. Without more money, patients might have to wait longer for treatments and hospitals could even start rationing care. But it is a big ask for Rachel Reeves, who is already trying to fill a £30 billion black hole in next month's budget. So, Alison, can we afford to dish out this cash to the NHS?
I don't think we can. I think we've seen that the NHS is just a bottomless money pit. Rachel Reeves already gave it something like 29 billion extra in real terms over the course of this parliament, but nothing seems good enough for the NHS. It keeps coming.
What's so frustrating, right, is that this idea of the NHS being a money pit is totally nonsensical. There are two reasons why NHS spending needs to be high right now. The first reason is that we underfunded it for a decade. From 2010 until 2019, we saw the longest consistent, sustained decrease in NHS funding as a percentage of GDP ever since its inception. That led to underfunding and lower capacity, which led to an increase in the waiting lists. Like, anytime a Conservative tries to tell you that the waiting lists are uniquely an artifact of the pandemic or industrial action, they are lying to you, because waiting lists were continually increasing again and again and again and again every year from 2010 until 2019, having inherited the best rated healthcare system in the world in 2010. And so that lack of capacity was then exposed during the pandemic. Not only were waiting lists already high because of underfunding, it was then also damaged by the additional burden placed upon it by the pandemic. So the reason why loads of money is having to be spent onto it now, firstly, is because we have to undo the underfunding from 2010 till 2019 with the lack of capacity that's been a problem for the NHS, even if you take the pandemic not into account. And then you have to spend even more extra to deal with the new level to which that there is burden placed upon the NHS by having a sicker population that is a result of underfunding for all of those years, right? When you underfund something for so long, you have to spend the money to get back to where you should have been had you not underfunded it, and then deal with all the second-order problems of the underfunding that created those long waiting lists in the first place. It's not an endless money pit. It has been an underfunded institution for too long, and it's costing more to fix those problems than it would have cost if we just funded it in the first place. In the wise words of the only economist I ever quote on this channel, Mariana Mazzucato, inaction is greater than the cost of action. The problem is, of course, if you're a capitalist like Alice Denby, something like social utility doesn't factor into your understanding. And fundamentally, she wants to frame the NHS as being all-consuming of state funds because she wants it privatised. It's as simple as that.
Back for more and more and more. And I think what's particularly frustrating about this ask is that a lot of the extra costs they're saying were incurred by the strikes. This was after doctors were already given an enormous pay rise and went on strike nonetheless for extra money. I think it just proves that that there's no amount of money that will ever satisfy the NHS. I think, as we say, Rachel Reeves has got her budget.
And again, the idea that the strikes were the problem that meant that we had to spend this money. I mean, I don't doubt that that's not the case, because NHS staff are saying that that's where they incurred those costs. But this is yet another problem that was caused by not spending money then, which is costing us even more money down the line. If the original Conservative government hadn't refused to negotiate with the resident doctors over industrial action and had settled to get them to the pay restoration that they deserve. Remember, they're still being paid less in real terms than they were getting paid in 2010 when the Conservatives inherited the best healthcare system in the world. And for a capitalist, she doesn't understand how markets work, right? Doctors will leave and go to Australia if they don't get good enough wages. They keep saying with the millionaires, or if you tax them, they'll leave. Well, how about if we don't pay the doctors well enough, they'll leave? Weird how they have so much concern for the capital flight of idiot tech bro wankers and bankers, but they have zero concern for the labour flight of our doctors and our nurses, Again, they're not asking for the world, they're asking for pay restoration to what had been cut and frozen since 2010 in real terms. That's not really asking for the world, is it? And again, there wouldn't have been these costs incurred by the NHS if the Tories had just settled with the doctors right at the start, rather than not even bothering to negotiate. Again, the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. Example number 3007.
Huge black hole to fill. She needs to be looking for productivity gains, not just more money. We need to be making the service more efficient, and we need to be getting more for our money.
Now, I don't doubt that productivity gains are something we should be looking at. No one is saying that we shouldn't be looking for productivity gains. I think that's reasonable, but the productivity gains in the public sector, in certain places like our more kind of holistic departments like education and health, is less easy, especially in education, less so in health, because technological advancement is something that is more easy in something like the healthcare sector. But these are sectors of our economy that are subject to Bournemouth's cost disease, where they get paid based upon what other sectors are paid elsewhere to stop losing staff, rather than because of their own productivity, because of the nature of the social value of those industries, rather than their market value, you know? That's where the pay comes from. So productivity gains would be quite hard. But when she says that we need to make it more efficient, outside of the money we waste on private sector subcontraction, which is inefficient because it's spending money on directorial salaries and shareholder dividends rather than frontline medical care, outside of that inefficiency, we actually have an incredibly efficient healthcare system. The fact that it's been working to the level that it has, even despite the massive underfunding from the Conservative governments of old, I say of old, I mean of 2010 till 2024, very efficient. That's what nurses and doctors will tell you, that despite the shoestring budgets they've had to manage on during the coalition years, they did operate pretty efficiently. If anything, I think that where you'd get more efficiency is hiring more managers and spending more money on people to overlook efficiencies and to overlook ways of working, rather than just saying cut DEI programs or whatever dumb shit she's talking about efficiency. We have a very efficient system.
What do you think, Michael? Is it throwing good money after bad?
No, I mean, I really object to the idea that it's a bottomless pit, because this money is being spent on doctors and nurses and equipment. And we don't actually spend that much on the NHS compared to other countries. So at the moment, much of Europe, France, Germany, they spend 12% of GDP. We spend 11% of GDP. So the idea that we're spending above the odds for the NHS is just untrue. We have an ageing population. We are going to continually have to spend more and more on the NHS. I think the issue is that we need politicians to be honest about that and say, we are going to have to keep spending more and more every year on the NHS. That's just the reality, which means we are going to have to increase taxes.
But I think that's the reality.
Well, it's the reality of an ageing population. And he's right, he's absolutely right. And it will mean higher taxes. And taxes should go up. Broadly, that should be fundamentally focused on higher earners and the wealthy very specifically, right? 100% should be focused on the wealthy. But I think that if we want Scandinavian quality public services, we should be accepting of paying Scandinavian taxes, right? I don't think that's unfair. We need to get people to buy into our taxation system. And fundamentally, it'll be easier to sell people on a wealth tax if we're also saying that taxation is good prima facie, and that you should be patriotic and you should be happy to pay taxes for good public services on the proviso that the wealthy, the people who hold huge amounts of assets, are contributing their fair share, which, to be fair, will be greater than yours. But that doesn't mean that you should have taxation as something that you expect somebody else to pay. We all should pay taxes. It's good to pay taxes. But we can't accept that the taxation burden on working people should go up and up and up if we won't also direct the powers of taxation much heavier manner at those who have inordinate amounts of wealth in a society where assets have been subsumed by the 1%.
The socialist model we have of the NHS, you mentioned France, it's got a social insurance model. There are other models of funding that we could have which involves more private sector funding.
Well, no, but fundamentally that money is being spent either way. This nonsense that Alice Denby and Nigel Farage talk about, well, if you change the funding model, then it'll mean we'll get better service provision. No, it won't do, right? The reason why France and Germany, all these other countries get better service is because they spend more money than we do as a percentage of GDP, right? Just because it's being spent in a different manner doesn't necessarily make it more efficient or better. There's just no argument for this other than the groupthink, the received wisdom of capitalists that the private sector is just better, with no theoretical backing as to why that might be. If you spend the money, you'll get a better service. Now, sure, you may say, well, that means that more people might pay money because they have to get social insurance, but that doesn't mean we can't just spend that money via the state anyway, and then get the same level of service provision by spending the extra money. It just means instead of paying money to social insurance, you pay more money in taxes. The mechanism for paying it is different, but fundamentally, more people will be paying more for better healthcare.
More of people paying their own money for appointments and so on. And these systems across the world get better outcomes than the NHS. You're right that we don't spend so much money per head, but we have considerably worse outcomes than many other comparable systems. I think we do need to get rid of this socialist model, because ultimately, when you have a sort of set a supply that is determined by the state, the only way you can handle demand is through rationing.
And maybe we do need.
Well, rationing is fair. Right, during the Second World War, I know this is not exactly the best comparison, but go with me. Like, during the Second World War, in both the UK and in the United States, when there was a social utility in distribution, Republicans, Democrats, the Labour Party, the Conservatives, the Liberals, they all fundamentally agree to completely suspend market forces internally when they were distributing food. Because the war effort was something of such great social utility that it was worth upending market forces to have state distribution to ensure that everyone got what they needed when supply was low. Now, when it comes to healthcare, supply isn't low, but demand is inelastic. It is inelastic demand. You will pay anything to live, because it's fundamentally the basic of life is being able to not die, hence healthcare. So that same kind of dynamic works. If you have it via a market, it won't go to who needs it the most, or where you gain the most social utility. All it will do is distribute it to those who have the best ability to pay. In the wise words of the second economist, who I will quote incessantly, Richard Wolff, right? If there is a shortage of milk for whatever reason that might be, right? I would like the milk to go and feed the children. I don't want it to go for rich people to be able to baby their pets with posh milk, for example, that is for the consumption of humans, right? The rich people may have more money and the poor people may have less money, but I don't fucking care, right? I don't subscribe to the same understanding of where things should be distributed that you do, because there is no social utility to that. It's also frustrating that they don't realise that rationing by price and rationing by waiting list are different forms of the same thing. Need
to pay a little bit more, or those that can afford, because we're putting more and more pressure on the NHS. We're ageing as a population, we're getting bigger as a population. This is essentially going to be a bill that just gets exponentially bigger, and then if you want to add on to that investing in future in initiatives and better equipment and better medicines, then that number's going to have to be a lot higher than we're paying at the moment.
Yeah, I mean,
well, if we're investing in equipment and facilities, that's capital expenditure. That doesn't come out of day-to-day spending. That's not relevant to this discussion.
the bill is going to keep going up. That's just the nature of having an aging population and having better technologies. I mean, we're all living better. This is a good news story, right? We shouldn't just feel down about it. The fact that people are living longer, that's great. You're right, there are lots of models that seem to work. So the French model, the Australian model is fine. It is worth pointing out, though, that the people who spend the highest amount on healthcare in the world are the Americans, and they have the worst outcomes, and that's because they've completely privatised their healthcare
Yeah, I don't
system.
think anybody would argue we should have a US-style system, but I think you're increasingly seeing people voting with your feet. The number of people who pay privately for GP appointments and so on because they just can't get one on the NHS is going up.
Well, we're talking about people going abroad as well now. If we're not taking care of our NHS to the point where people are then going abroad, it's costing us more, actually. So if you think about it in those terms, can we afford not to invest that $3 billion that's being requested?
No, I think what this shows is that people are actually prepared to pay for their own healthcare, that we don't actually have to cleave to this post-war socialist model of the NHS. I think that the idea...
Also, socialised healthcare is not socialism. It's not socialism when the government does stuff. Socialism is when the workers control the means of production, distribution and exchange. It's not when the government runs a public service. But again, people don't want to pay for private healthcare. People want the state to provide. Every single poll shows that there is overwhelming support for this. It's just the reality of the kind of politics that people like Alice Denby have parroted for years and years and years. Remember, she works for CAPEX, which is the journalistic wing of the think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies. It was literally set up by Margaret Thatcher and the Chicago boys Bellends, who led us to the neoliberal hellscape we now live in, right? She is not a neutral actor here. She is a propagandist for a dark money think tank, essentially, by being linked to the Centre for Policy Studies. And their fundamental position has been, in supporting the Conservative Party, underfund the NHS explicitly to make it perform so badly to justify privatization. That has been the three-card trick from day one of Conservative politics. From day one, they've always wanted it privatized. They always have done. And now she is going, well, like, it's so bad because of how bad it's been performing since 2010 when miraculously it started being underfunded, but which means the NHS is broken, the model doesn't work and we have to privatize it. And I'm like, despite all of those failures, people still don't want what you're selling. People still aren't picking up what you're putting down, Alice. We can all see through it. And of course, as you say, Original Demo, well pointed out, if people get private, they're just jumping the queue. A lot of the facilities and staff, in fact, the majority of facilities and staff that the private sector is able to use are borrowed from the NHS, right? They use NHS hospitals and NHS doctors taking on extra work to make more money. We were literally number one in the world in 2010. We had the best healthcare system in the world in 2010. And then what happened to it, you know? Fundamentally, what she is arguing for is two-tier healthcare. That's what these social insurance models create, is two-tier healthcare, where the rich get to have access to the best healthcare because they can pay for it, and poor people who get access to state-funded healthcare get the worst of it because they are fundamentally now competing with a private sector that can do it better, you know? In this model where they're the one getting all the money and the state is stripping funding away from public healthcare.
That we have this kind of political idea that it's, I mean, what is it called, the national religion? I think we need to get away from that. We need to be much more honest about the fact that the NHS actually gets much worse outcomes than other comparable health systems. It's not this kind of best of British thing.
I mean, it was in 2010 before the Tories destroyed it. Like, they say this every time. They say this every time, go, well, the NHS can't be treated as this kind of magnum opus of British achievement. And I'm like, well, it was in 2010. Literally, like, before the Conservative Party decided hacking away at and cutting budgets, slashing capital expenditure, failing on what was pointed out by Ben in chat on things like modernisation and digitisation and repair programmes, all this kind of stuff, rack concrete, all of these things that we could have engaged when bond yields were literally zero, when the interest rates were nothing, when we were in a liquidity trap, when money was basically free for the government to be able to borrow under the model that they were working on because they weren't MMT pilled at that point. Probably should have been, given that even low interest rates and quantitative easing couldn't increase interest rates. It was totally free for them to do it, and they didn't do it. They literally destroyed the NHS deliberately. The only reason those other systems are getting better outcomes than we are is because the Conservative Party deliberately and maliciously underfunded it.
It's just a public service like any other, and it should be improved.
Okay, let's go to the calls. Nancy from London, what's your thoughts?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. My thoughts about this is that we have the best service anyone can have in the world, in spite of all the complaints and all the things that people are saying. I would rather pay more from my tax so that we can have this service. There are so many countries whereby you cannot even get health care if you do not have so much money. So I think we should invest more in our NHS service by us paying more into it.
Well, Alice, what would you say to the statement that Nancy made that we have the best care anywhere?
I'm afraid it's just not true, Nancy. I mean, our cancer survival rates are much lower than comparable OECD countries. It's just not true that we have the best service anywhere in the world. And there are many people should be demanding more of the NHS. I don't think this idea that it's so wonderful actually survives any contact you might have with it. You look at the massive scandals we have in maternity services, for example, 1 in 5 maternity services not safe for women giving birth. Those aren't women who are ill. Those are just women going through a natural human process. It's not good enough and it needs to be better. And I think this kind of shibboleth that we have in our politics about it stands in the way of really holding it to.
But she wants to pay more to fix it. Those are problems, and she's saying, yes, pay more tax. Like, you both fundamentally agree that more money should go into it, except you seem to think that it's just a natural problem of the model of the NHS that's the issue, when in reality it's the underfunding that your political ideology inflicted upon it.
Count as we should be doing.
And we're talking about the NHS in England here, but actually similar things are happening all over. In Scotland, they've had an injection of money recently into the NHS, and although things have improved slightly, we're still not back to pre-pandemic levels. So I suppose the question is, Nancy, how much money are you willing to put into the NHS to try and get it into a position that maybe even you remember as a child?
Well, I would say probably another 10%. I really disagree. My personal experience, I had a first child and I had problems. But from then onwards, I remember being very ill at the point of death, and I know how the ambulance people came and took me into hospital. If I hadn't been able to get into hospital, I would have lost my life. I know that the service could have been quicker, but having said that, I could have lost my life about 3 years ago. And I've been in situations that have been very difficult, and I can't fault the care. I still believe that the NHS is still a service that should be admired, and we should all pay more into it if we can, so that we can sustain this service. Rather than being something like America, if you don't have insurance, you can't get care. Or some African countries, you can't even get to the hospital due to various circumstances. I will still support the NHS. I will pay more from my wages to make sure this service is sustained, because
Because again, if you want those better outcomes, it'll have to get paid for, and it'll come out of people's wages regardless. The question is, do you want some of that money being sucked through insurers, a social insurance model, or do you want that going basically to the state to run it in an efficient manner in a centrally planned system, which makes sense in a natural monopoly like healthcare with inelastic demand? Like, it's really not a difficult fundamental thing here. Like, or everyone is agreeing here in this discussion that more money needs to be paid, but for some reason Alice Denby is saying that you can't pay extra via taxes. For some reason it has to come through social insurance, even though fundamentally we all agree that we need to spend more. That's what's so silly about her argument, is that she can't rationalise or justify why privatisation is necessary to achieve the ends of spending more in it. Again, fundamentally because she just doesn't want to pay more tax.
been treated well on it, and
Nancy,
my family has.
I have to say it's really nice to hear a positive story about the NHS, because a lot of the time when we do these discussions, the people...
I mean, literally, I have never had a bad experience with the NHS. Never. Never. I've had to have a long wait in A&E, for example, for something that fundamentally isn't particularly urgent, right? Like, whatever. Every single relationship I have with the NHS has been very, very positive outside of the waiting list for trans healthcare, but that's a political problem rather than an NHS problem, right? Like, I really haven't had any problems at all. All the staff have been wonderful. Hospitals have been clean, been efficient. Maybe I've just been pretty healthy. Like, I've never had long-term health complications that have required being on a waiting list, for example. So I guess I'm unique in that regard. Well, not unique, but in the minority. But I haven't had that bad of a time with the NHS.
Call in, that feel compelled to call in, are people that have had very, very bad experiences with them, have been left waiting, have misdiagnoses, all sorts of things. So it's great to hear that you have had a fantastic... I also have had great treatment on the NHS, and I think when you have, and if you've been at the brink of life and death, I think you probably would be quite evangelical about it. You would think this is the one thing that we have to save more than anything else. Nancy, thank you for your call.
I was going to say, I think what's also just very admirable about what Nancy said is she was willing to put her money where her mouth is. She says, I value the NHS. I know that's going to cost a lot more money. That means I'm willing to pay more of my income towards the NHS. I would agree with that. And I think actually lots of the public would. I think Labour made a big mistake when they said we're not going to raise any of the big taxes. Gordon Brown in the early 2000s stood up at the budget, said, I'm going to put a penny on national insurance and it's going to go to the NHS, most popular budget in decades.
Well, I think
literally so true. That's such a great point, right? Like, that's one thing I've been banging on about over and over again on the channel, that the tying of hands that Morgan McSweeney essentially pushed upon the Exchequer by promising not to raise any of the big three, by essentially trying to say we can just manage the state better because we're the good guys and the Tories are corrupt and they're the bad team, is going to be the biggest reason that Labour fail. Because they didn't just get buy-in pre-election for tax rises that everyone knew was necessary. Everyone knew was necessary. It was open that there was going to be cuts in public services, in unprotected departments because of necessary expenditure elsewhere that would have led to an £18 billion black hole. It was a conspiracy of silence, and the Labour Party refused to accept that and tried to essentially con the public. And now we've got a budget in November. Taxes will have to go up, and Rachel Reeves is going to have to break her promises because fundamentally Labour lied to the public. Like, they should have been open about the necessity of raising taxes to fund the NHS. And as you pointed out quite rightly there, Michael, as you pointed out quite rightly, people are very happy to do so by putting a point on national insurance or the 50p rate of tax, whatever it is.
Problem is the trust and whether we believe that that money will be ring-fenced. A lot of the time when we do these conversations, that is the question that comes up. Clive from London, do you think that Rachel Reeves should find $3 billion for the NHS?
It's a difficult one, I think, because I'm really thankful for the NHS. I've got like a long-term health condition, but I think there's so much waste in the NHS. So to give you two examples, my mother used to have problems walking, and when she died, we said, we called them up and we said, do you want to come and get the walking frames? Do you want to take them back?
Yeah.
When do you want to come and do it? And they said, no, just throw them away. And another example, I went and picked up a prescription, and they said, gave me the wrong tablets. And I went back to the chemist and got the correct tablets, and I handed back the existing tablets. The tablets were wrong, and they said to me, no, we can't send them back, just throw them away. And I think, you know, we should give them more money, but I think until they sort these problems and this waste of money, it's just like giving money to a big black hole.
Yeah, I mean, the crutch example I've had in my own family as well, where somebody tried to give it back and they said no, and it blows my mind. I don't understand why they can't find some sort of process of cleaning them, why you just get rid of them. I can't work that one out. A lot of people talk about waste, not just the practical waste there, as Clive brought up, medicines and walking sticks and that sort of thing. Also, a lot of people complain about middle management.
And those people are idiots. Those people are morons. Like, I'm sorry. I mean, I don't want to be rude, actually. These people are just uninformed. That's probably what I'll say. It's probably better for me to say that. I'll be nice. They're uninformed because if you actually look at comparisons between the NHS and healthcare systems elsewhere in the OECD, NHS is undermanaged. Our expenditure and our staffing on administration specifically is lower than the median level of other OECD countries. We are undermanaged. In fact, there are probably more efficiency that we can find by having more people who are in managerial positions who are specifically there to try and increase efficiency, to try and find better ways of working, to actually do people management. But again, these were positions that were considered unnecessary. They were considered surplus to requirements during the austerity years, and they were cut back, and it's left us in a worse position. Thank you, Ross, for the 5 gifts. Thank you, Ross, for the £5. If central banks funded better healthcare and social housing, would lowering the cost of living counter the currency debasement inflation? I believe so. Yes, that's one of the main things I believe of kind of Keynesian and MMT theory, which is if you increase the supply side through fiscal expansion, then the increase in demand will go along with an increase in supply and make everyone better off, whilst growing the economy. Thank you, the Jack Miller, for the £10. Reminder that the Greens reject encroaching privatisation. Labour want more privatisation. It has no place in a public health service. The Greens are way more to the party of the NHS than Labour. Very, very true, very true. In fact, we have we have Labour lords lobbying for the PFI sector. That's what we read when we found out when they were looking at PFIs again from the Guardian article. People are literally dying because of lack of money. Case notes not being read, transcribed and transferred to other departments correctly. A lack of admin even, sorry. Yes, yeah, you're right, Jordan.
And
well, a lot of people complain about middle management. I think we have had a problem in this country where governments go after, they say, oh, we should give money to doctors and nurses, but all the people in the back room, let's cut that to the bone. And actually, there's lots of analysis that says that's actually where we're not putting enough money. Because you do really need to have middle management to organise when the operation is, who needs to be there. Because at the moment, speaking to people in the NHS, you hear lots about doctors being sent to the wrong place, nurses being told to come in on this day, but then the operation getting cancelled.
Real waste.
And so I think there's a kind of populist attack, I think, on middle managers that isn't necessarily the best thing for the NHS. Because when it comes to, crutches and the like, that's partly because presumably they import them very cheaply from China. And you have to pay people quite a lot to go and pick them up and wash them in the UK.
So it would be more expensive.
And again, if we really want to talk about waste, thank you, bloody blah, for the £5. We're spending money on privatisation. Like, we spend money on PFIs that goes into profits and shareholder dividends and directorial salaries, which could be going into frontline care. It could be going on more managers, more administration, right, which we've all agreed now is necessary to have a better functioning health service. And instead, we're paying money to CEOs of private healthcare companies or of private healthcare subcontractors or Sodexo and their shareholders who have no interest in a good running NHS. They're there for one reason and one reason only, and that's to make money.
Probably more.
to wash
It's
them
probably
and buy
cheap.
them new?
I think the NHS, if it were cheaper to get those crutches back, they would do it. I think there's an environmental question. Maybe they should do it, but I think they're probably making a decision that that's the cheapest thing to do.
Well, that is surprising. Clive, thank you very much for your call and bringing that to our attention. Alfonso from Birmingham, do you think we should find $3 billion for the NHS?
Well, not really, though. Instead of funneling ever-increasing budgets into the NHS, we should look at spending money towards community health centres and well-run nursing homes, because this puts a lot of stress on the NHS, and we tend to use the NHS for virtually everything. It's like a capture-all syndrome, rather than having more specialised services that can prevent prevent illnesses in the first place.
Well, I mean, if it's community diagnostic centres and that stuff, they'll come out of the NHS budget anyway, or at least the DHSC budget.
Or have cheaper alternatives by funding nursing homes rather than the health centre.
Yeah, and actually there's studies done that when you use preventative care, you do save money in the long run. So maybe not throwing it into the NHS, but throwing it into other schemes. Would you support that, Alice?
Well, Lindsay, that will come out of the DHSC budget anyway. Like, that's broadly what we're talking about here, not the NHS as a thing, right? There's an NHS budget, but that's mostly just funding that is coming out of the DHSC.
Yeah, I think your viewers have absolutely nailed this problem. I think Clive's absolutely right that the public it's a huge priority for the public. They want to see money spent on it, but they want to see it spent well. And I think Alfonso's put his finger on the real problem that we have, which is social care, which is not funded in the same way out of central government funding. It's funded by local authorities, and that is where the huge pressure comes on the NHS. It is with people needing lifelong care, and that's where we need a long-term sustainable settlement for social care.
Which is crazy, given that one of the big things that's bad about social care is the private providers are shit. Like, the people who she trusts to deliver good care, i.e. the private sector, are the result of so much scandal in terms of poor quality of care in the social care sector that is also having to bankrupt councils as well. We should bring that into the state's remit too. Get it out of the cowboy social care, private equity-owned private sector providers and have a nationalised care service.
And probably that is going to have to involve some people paying for their own care.
It's not often that I get good news in my ear while I'm doing a show, but I've just been given some. Apparently the NHS has started a reuse scheme for crutches. So if you do have, it's relatively new, if you do have one, don't listen to what we've been saying. Go to the NHS and ask where you can give it back so they can clean it for somebody else to use.
Just a waste of money. Throw them away.
Recycle them. Yeah, don't listen to Michael. do try and give them back. I don't know whether the hospital near you will be running the scheme, but try. Alfonso, thank you very much for your call. Anne from Devon, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I've been in hospital for 2 weeks. Now, can I ask that woman on today,
Alice. Yes.
Alice, how many hours a day does she work? Because the nurses and doctors do 12-hour shifts. How many other people do 12-hour shifts? They were absolutely fantastic.
Okay, Alice, I think.
I mean, and fundamentally, they would have to work a shorter amount of time. They would not have such grueling days if we spent more money on staffing in the NHS and we spread that workload around. It would lead to better care. People would be less tired, less stressed. And it would lead to better retention of existing healthcare workers who we are losing to being too stressed because we have understaffed the NHS. And I think you'll find, even if someone who works for a think tank, or at least a second order of a think tank, claims to work many hours in a day, I don't think those hours involve much hard work. I would know, right? I'm a paid talking head. My job is to be a paid talking head, just like Alice Denby and indeed Michael Walker is, right? That is literally our job, is to be paid talking heads. Spoiler alert, I don't work very hard. I do not have a grueling job. I do not work anywhere near as hard as a nurse. In fact, I work probably not as hard as most people who have real full-time jobs, right? Take it from me, chat. Alice Denby does not work hard. Take it from someone who knows.
Your criticism is that you were talking about the money going to doctors that were striking, nurses that were striking. Do you defend that? Do you think they're worth the money? Would you pay them more, pay them less?
I think they had a very generous, the doctors in particular, nurses not so much, and it's great to hear that you've had good care in hospital. That's not everybody's experience at all. No, I think they've had very generous pay rises. They have much more generous pensions than many people in the private sector, many of whom work far longer days than 12 hours.
But come on. There is no one in the private sector who has, like, a worse pension than a doctor does who works longer. I'm sorry, that's just not true. That's just not true. The only people who are working that long in the private sector are people who are being forced to work that long because their wages are so shit they can't afford to live otherwise. But she's referring to like professionals. And there are no like private sector professional PMC people who are working 12-hour days who get worse pensions than a doctor. That's just not true. There are just people who are forced to work 12-hour days in the private sector because they're working 2 jobs because the private sector pays like shit. And again, like, the doctor's pay settlement is still worse than what they had in real terms in 2010.
And look, of course, people get amazing care in the NHS, but if you look at comparable countries with different funding models, they get better outcomes, and that's really what matters at the end of the day. What matters to you if you're ill?
I mean, though they get better outcomes because they spend more money. We could do that. It's not the mechanism of funding that is causing that problem. It's the level of funding. She still hasn't overcome this, although I guess I'm watching this in retrospect, but hey, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.